The 19th Amendment, ratified in 1920, was a victory for America's female population. The document states, "The rights of citizens of the United States to vote should not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex." While this would prove to be a step in the right direction toward gender equality, the right to vote would not be enough. To ensure that women's rights were protected by the Constitution, a woman named Alice Paul, an activist who wanted to achieve equal rights between the sexes, spent her life making it her responsibility.
Yet one document has been created in an attempt to bridge the inequality. The ERA, or the Equal Rights Amendment, was an attempt to amend the Constitution to include protections for women. The document itself states equality of rights under the law should not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex. With the signing of this amendment, a national president would be created, allowing women a shield against inequality, the right to not be discriminated against due to their gender. While the 19th Amendment allowed women their suffrage, one woman had the foresight to know that this would not be enough.
This is Rights Aren't Always Equal, the birth and stagnation of the ERA.
For much of America's history, women have been limited within society. They could not vote, own land, have a bank account, or even claim custody of their children during divorces. While there have certainly been many powerful females who sought to dismantle these systems, a woman named Alice Paul made a move that would cause any level of discrimination based on gender to be labeled unconstitutional. On January 11, 1885, in Mount Laurel, New Jersey, Alice Paul was born into a wealthy family and was a part of a rather religious community. Paul was shaped by her environment and understood there to be equality between men and women. In her own words, when the Quakers were founded, one of their principles was and is equality of the sexes. So I never had any other idea. The principle was always there, implying that it wasn't until she went and attended multiple women's suffrage meetings with her mother that she had been exposed to the opposing ideals that women were socially inferior to men. From then on, Alice Paul was determined to bring change to the rampant epidemic of gender inequality in the United States.
Many states had laws that made it difficult for married women to work. If married women worked, they didn't necessarily own their own earnings, and they didn't have the same rights as husbands and fathers over their own children. So they thought that if they had a constitutional amendment that made discrimination against women illegal and unconstitutional, that would be a huge step towards women actually being equal.
Paul first began her campaign in England to study social work and joined the British suffrage movement, which taught her about militant protest strategies, including how to break windows, hunger strikes, forming picket lines, and a few other forms of civil disobedience. Paul returned to America and eventually graduated with her PhD in economics and a law degree, which she used to better navigate politics. In 1913, Alice Paul led an estimated 8,000 women in a march just outside the White House. There, the protesters were bombarded by insults and were physically abused until her tenacity gained an audience from President Woodrow Wilson. Seeking concrete congressional change, Paul formed the National Women's Party in 1916.
Before Paul's work on the ERA, a certain bill existed requiring a woman's citizenship and rights. The Expatriation Act mandated that any woman who married a foreigner had to take their husband's nationality regardless of where they resided. Acts like this showed that a woman's very identity belonged to her husband. Another law limiting women's equality in society was the National Recovery Act. This law stated, the National Recovery Act forbids more than one family member from holding a government job. This resulted in many women losing their careers as their husbands would often keep the better position.
Paul and National Women's Party united to fight against laws like these by protesting peacefully. Perhaps the most important protest was the Silent Sentinels picket of 1917. In this protest, about 1,000 of these women, including Paul, dedicated themselves to an 18-month-long picket in front of the White House. They all held signs voicing their grievances about the cycle of inequality towards women. While they participated in the protest, they endured both verbal and physical abuse from bystanders. Eventually, the police violated their freedom to peacefully protest and arrested the women for the charge of obstructing traffic. Paul was imprisoned for 7 months, 6 of which she participated in a hunger strike. She was threatened by the personnel at the prison to be sent into an insane asylum. They had later been forced to force-feed Paul. We can see the aims of this group in their tools of protest. Signs like these suggested that Alice Paul should have been treated as a political offender, as opposed to a prisoner, as she was merely acting upon her rights as an American citizen. Other signs like this suggest that women called out the hypocrisy of President Wilson by using his statements against him. Quotes like, "Liberty is the fundamental demand of the human spirit," show how Wilson saw the value of liberty but was unwilling to offer this freedom to women at the time. With all these limitations, Alice Paul developed a solution to several women's problems. Thus, in 1923, the Equal Rights Act was passed after the ratification of the 19th Amendment. The ERA was drafted as a potential amendment to the Constitution, and if signed, would have granted more protections for women under the law. The document states, "Equality of rights under the law shall not be denied nor abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex." This means that women would have the legal means to fight gender discrimination in the courts.
Men and women shall have equal rights throughout the United States and every place subject to its jurisdiction.
Although distracted by the after-effects of World War I and the later Great Depression, the ERA started gaining slow support. Eventually, by the 1940s, the Equal Rights Amendment was added to both the Republican and Democratic Party platforms.
However, despite being a platform for both parties, the bill struggled to find the numbers in Congress. After all, only 10 women served in the Senate during this era, with no more than 2 serving at the same time. In the 1960s, the ERA was reborn thanks to powerful women such as U.S. Representatives Bella Abzug, Betty Friedan, and Gloria Steinem. These major figureheads embodied a growing desire to promote feminist ideas, make changes to outdated stereotypes, and make sure that all females get and keep the same rights as men to help get rid of discrimination. An organization that united these goals was the National Organization of Women, or NOW. One of the aims of these women was to reintroduce the ERA in every session of Congress. By organizing marches, rallies, pickets, and nonviolent civil disobedience, these women were able to gather hundreds of thousands of people and began fighting for the ERA, repealing all abortion laws and creating publicly funded childcare.
Gradually, instead of a little tiny cluster, we now have 10 million women backing this particular measure before Congress.
With enough pressure and influence, the bill won the required 2/3 vote from the House of Representatives in October 1971, and in March 1972, the bill won in the Senate. Soon after, President Richard Nixon endorsed the ERA's approval upon its passage.
Let's take a more recent look at the Equal Rights Amendment. In 1971, the House of Representatives voted in favor of the ERA. They passed it 354 to 23. And the Senate did the same in the following March by a margin of 84 to 8. So on March 22, 1972, the ERA was ushered out of Congress. Now, this simply does not make it law. In order for any amendment to be added to the Constitution, 2/3 of the states must ratify it within 7 years.
However, some people did not agree with the ERA. Perhaps the most vocal opponent of the ERA was Phyllis Schlafly. Schlafly was an anti-feminist who believed if women had the same rights as men, then they would be forced to enlist in the army and they would not have gender-specific privileges.
When you make the laws apply equally to men and women, you end up taking away many of the rights that women now have. For example, the Equal Rights Amendment will make our young women subject to the draft and military combat the next time we have one of these wars that we have every 10 years.
She had a large following since women were scared of going to war and of the ERA undermining programs for women. This can be seen in the Dependent Wife Clause, in which widows who receive Social Security benefits may be more likely to receive custody of their children. Schlafly's efforts proved fruitful as she was able to spread enough concern about the passage of this amendment.
The ERA was nearing official ratification and would have been included in the Constitution as the 28th Amendment. However, a counterwave of protests began to spread. The Eagle Forum, an organization led by Phyllis Schlafly, took the opportunity to spread doubt in congressmen's minds around the nation. By writing convincing literature to state governors, bribing congressmen with homemade bread, and delivering quiches to all 53 senators, along with a note saying real men do not attract women, Schlafly's organization made it their responsibility to end the ERA. They were able to cause just enough states to deny the ERA. Their argument revolved around women's rights being already protected under the Constitution.
Despite the overwhelming initial support from major political and social figures of this time, Schlafly's Stop campaign gained incredible support from the common housewife. These women united and strategically targeted the remaining states that had still not signed the ERA. Their protests, in the form of mass letters, petitions, and even baked goods, convinced these legislators that not all women wanted the 28th Amendment. Ultimately, Schlafly found success. Her efforts sparked enough doubt in the state legislators to halt the bill for nearly 50 years. It wasn't until 2020 that the ERA was revisited. With the signing of Virginia, the ERA has received enough votes to be ratified. However, it is unclear about whether or not the bill will be passed, since they got all the signatures they needed after the deadline. Congress will now have to decide whether they want to extend the deadline of the bill and include all the signatures they acquired, or if they are going to redo the bill and begin the ratification process all over again.
There have been several supporters of the bill during its ratification process, such as former Presidents Jimmy Carter and Richard Nixon, Bella Abzug, and Justice Sandra Day O'Connor. Today, the movement toward ratification includes Danica Roem, Kate Kelly Esquire, and Carol Jenkins.
The first time the Equal Rights Amendment was put forward was 100 years ago. Our resolution will help address centuries of gender discrimination in America by removing the unnecessary barriers that have prevented us from enshrining the dignity, the humanity, and equality of women into our United States Constitution.
That's where you can help. Just as Alice Paul made it her responsibility to birth the ERA, now that she's gone, it is our responsibility to ensure that the bill emerges from its stagnation. By contacting your state's legislators, just as we did, you too can advocate for women's rights. With enough petitions, the federal government may once again establish a deadline to ratify the bill. With enough votes, women will finally have their rights protected by the Constitution.